Mark was running late, his truck's engine roaring as he rushed to his appointment. But when he climbed behind the wheel, something stopped him. Sophie's luxury car was blocking his way, and no matter how many times Mark honked, she wouldn't move. This wasn't going to end quietly. Mark had always been a hard-working truck driver. He'd spent years on the road, making sure cargo got delivered on time. But today was different. He had overslept and was already behind schedule. His hands gripped the steering wheel as he quickly tried to make up for lost time. The last thing he needed was an obstacle. That's when he saw Sophie's car, blocking his path. It was a sleek, expensive sports car, and it was parked in the middle of the street, completely blocking his way. Mark couldn't believe it. He honked the horn, hoping she would move, but nothing happened. He leaned on the horn again, but the car stayed still. He could see movement inside. She was clearly in there. Annoyed, Mark thought it was just a quick stop, but when she didn't budge, his patience began to run thin. Finally, Sophie rolled down her window. She looked at him with a smug expression, clearly annoyed by the honking. "Mind your business," she shouted, as if she was too important to care. Mark's blood started to boil. This was going to be a long day. Mark's frustration grew as he honked again, his eyes locked on Sophie's car. He couldn't believe she wasn't moving. He could see her inside, tapping away on her phone, completely ignoring him. Mark honked a third time, harder this time, hoping she would finally get the hint. But instead of driving off, Sophie just threw up her middle finger through the window, as if it was nothing. Mark couldn't believe what he was seeing. Was she really that rude? His heart raced with anger. He rolled down his window and yelled toward her, "Hey, you need to move your car. It's illegal to park here." He waited, hoping she'd at least apologize and drive off. But Sophie just laughed, shaking her head. The young woman leaned out of her window, her face filled with a mixture of arrogance and annoyance. "It's a free country, isn't it? I'll park wherever I want," she shot back. Her words hit Mark like a slap. She was so full of herself, acting like she was better than him. Mark was stunned, but his patience was running out. He needed to get to his appointment, and this woman was making it impossible. "You need to move, or I'll call the cops," he warned. Sophie rolled her eyes, clearly not taking him seriously. But something inside Mark snapped. This wasn't going to end like this. Mark couldn't believe what he was hearing. Sophie was still sitting there, not even trying to move her car. His frustration boiled over, and he stormed out of his truck. He marched toward her car, his mind racing with anger. As he reached her window, he knocked on the roof of her car, hoping to get her attention. Sophie finally looked up, her eyes cold. "What's the problem now?" she asked, her tone dripping with sarcasm. Mark could barely keep his voice steady. "You're blocking me in. You need to move, now," he said through gritted teeth. Sophie smirked. "I don't have to do anything for you," she snapped. Her words were harsh, and the look on her face made it clear she didn't care about the trouble she was causing. Mark couldn't believe it. Was she really this entitled? As the conversation continued, it became clear that Sophie thought she was better than him. She didn't see him as a person, just some truck driver who didn't matter. "My dad could buy your company and have you fired by tomorrow," she said, almost casually, as if that was supposed to make Mark back down. Her words stung, but they only made him more determined to stand his ground. Mark's mind raced. He couldn't believe someone like this actually existed. He had seen people like her on the news or in movies, but never in real life. He couldn't let her get away with this. Sophie's sense of superiority was impossible to ignore, and Mark knew he had to do something about it. If he let her get away with this, nothing would change. Finally, Mark took a deep breath. "I'm calling the police if you don't move your car," he threatened. Sophie rolled her eyes, but she finally started her car and drove away, still shouting insults as she went. Mark watched her disappear, his blood still boiling. Mark finally managed to finish his deliveries and had a chance to calm down. But Sophie's words and attitude still echoed in his mind. He couldn't shake the feeling that something had to be done about her behavior. He couldn't let someone like her get away with acting so entitled, treating people like they were beneath her. The more Mark thought about it, the angrier he became. He decided he was going to make sure Sophie learned a lesson she'd never forget. That evening, Mark got to work. He searched for Sophie's car online using the license plate number. After a few hours, he found her social media accounts and began piecing things together. Mark wasn't just going to teach her a small lesson. He was going to make her think twice before she ever acted like that again. He didn't want to hurt her, but he wanted her to understand that there were consequences for how she treated others. Mark didn't waste any time. He tracked down her address using the information he had found online, then drove to her house that night. He parked nearby, his heart racing. It wasn't easy to do something like this, but he was determined to follow through. He didn't want to just be angry anymore. He wanted to take control. The next morning, Mark checked Sophie's social media. His plan was working. Sophie was getting bombarded with messages and notifications. Her phone overheated and froze under the pressure. At first, she thought it was a dream come true. Finally, people were paying attention to her. But when she saw what they were saying, the excitement quickly turned to panic. She was being ridiculed and mocked across the internet. Mark couldn't help but smile as he saw the chaos unfold. It was the perfect lesson. Sophie had finally learned what it felt like to be on the other side of the internet's harsh judgment. Maybe now she would understand how it felt to be disrespected. Sophie couldn't believe what was happening. Her phone was going crazy, with constant notifications pouring in from all directions. At first, she thought it was just some kind of viral moment, maybe even the attention she'd always wanted. But as she checked her social media accounts, her excitement quickly turned to dread. People were not congratulating her or sending compliments. They were calling her names and mocking her every move. Her phone had overheated, then froze, unable to handle the overwhelming amount of messages flooding in. Sophie quickly grabbed her laptop, desperate to figure out what was going on. But when she saw what everyone was saying, a wave of horror washed over her. Her posts were being shared everywhere, and they weren't the kind of shares she'd hoped for. People were tagging her, calling her spoiled, arrogant, and rude. It was everywhere. Sophie felt sick to her stomach. As the hours passed, Sophie's hope that it was all some kind of mistake began to fade. It wasn't going away. People were commenting on every post, even sending private messages calling her out for her behavior. At first, she tried to ignore it, but it was impossible. Her online world was falling apart, and she couldn't stop it. Meanwhile, Mark was feeling a mix of satisfaction and relief. He knew he couldn't be there to see the fallout, but part of him was glad to know Sophie was finally seeing what it felt like to be humiliated. It wasn't about revenge. It was about making sure she understood the impact of her actions. Sophie's entitled attitude had caught up with her, and there was nothing she could do to stop it now. Sophie's social media accounts were flooded with negativity, and soon she realized there was no way out. No matter how much she tried to fix it, the damage was done. She had become a target for the entire internet, and there was no turning back.